Cool. Ready? All right. Functional juggling training course, class 2. Today we're going to be looking at the meaning of functional juggling, the idea with this terminology, and the theory of process formations. So yesterday was more about the philosophy. It was more about deconstructing, trying to figure out what our actual challenges are, so that we can identify the areas that we need to create solutions. Um, that was day one. Day two is when we begin the process of reconstruction. So we deconstructed the idea. Hopefully, we deconstructed this idea that juggling is not its action, and we all agree with this. And now today we can start to focus on how we are going to reconstruct this idea using different formulas and solutions to do that. Today's class structure we're going to start off by reviewing the topics from yesterday. Should still be pretty fresh, and then presentation of the new materials, application of activities. So today we will have a student-led assignment where you'll be asked to apply the ideas in your own creative ways, and then we do a feedback and a sharing. So if anyone doesn't feel comfortable sharing, that's okay. You can let us know. You're not required to, but we find that it's really, really helpful. Even if you feel like, oh, I have no idea what I'm doing right now, and I don't know if I'm doing this right. Those are usually the best examples we find. Um, and then the intention of the class is to develop awareness of teaching strategies through personal experience and application. And although some materials may appear technical in their origin, it is important to remember that their applications are always intended to be playful, organic, and fun. And that learning will definitely be occurring in layers, because it's this process of deconstruction and reconstruction, and none of it really makes sense until we see the whole picture, right? And we really look at the end result and what the implications are of all of these changes. The theory is just here. We're sharing it more as a way to guide our conversation, to transition our perspectives. So I always emphasize at the beginning of the classes, don't pressure yourself with the theory, pressure yourself with the play. To review the topics from yesterday, we started off with this idea that in order to make juggling accessible for everyone, then we need to find a way to describe it that does not relate to its action, because actions are really subjective. Human beings come in many different forms, and there's such a variety. So there is not one single action that I'm aware of that every single human being can do, other than like sort of breathe. Um, so if we describe juggling by its action, we know we're gonna alienate somebody. So right away, we know that our solution is going to be somehow involved in describing juggling that doesn't describe its action. And to do that requires us to look more internally, to look at the brain, because this is where our experience comes from. And once we start to look there, we get a lot of really good clues right away that sort of guides us. And this first part is is a little bit confusing because of the way that the terminology is laid out for the solution. It's very abstract at first, and also because of like the order of understanding. Like we came to the solution by understanding the state of mind and decoding its process. So like we don't really have all the information to understand how we arrived at this conclusion yet, but it's going to make more sense as we go through the course. And just to repeat, it's a managed anti-entropic sequence of orbital events harmonized by space and time. This is a formula with 4 components. The first one being a managed, meaning it has to be an activity that is experienced. Otherwise, there is no experience. And then the next 2 parts is really about the patterns, about what type of patterns, what is the order of interactions that we create with this type of activity. And that's anti-entropic sequences and orbital events. And both of the things, the sensory thing that relates to that description is that they both act to distort our sensory relationship with linear time, because we create our sense of linear time through changes in space over time. The less changes we have in space over time, the less aware we are of the passage of linear time. And this is why music, dance, and juggling are really great for producing this sense of presence. And it's that sense of presence that alters the way the brain is starting to process information. It triggers. It's very similar to what we observe when people are in states of play and mindfulness and meditation. Right? It is a reality of what the brain can do, and it's our relationship that we form with time that allows us to transition. And then the 4th component is harmonized by space and time, or really harmonized by space-time. But we break these terms apart in this course because we're focused on developing our relationships with them separately. Because if we can understand them separately, then we can understand them together as well. So the part of the equation here is this last part. It talks about the sensory relationship we form, and this is the part of the equation where we can start to change this portion, or as we adapt this portion, our means of interaction is where we start to see the separation, the line between juggling and other things. It's how we process the experience sensory that determines whether we call it juggling music or dance or anything else. Um, a big part to opening up this conversation, to simplifying it. I don't know what your communities are like, but I've traveled around and I've met a lot of people who can struggle grasping this idea that juggling is not its action at the beginning. And I find a really helpful way to explain to these people is to make a difference between the expression and experience of an activity, because this is going to be true for everything, not just juggling. Um, and the idea here is that there is an expression of an activity is the action I use to produce it. Like an expression of music would be the instrument I use to create the music. So an expression of juggling would be the object I use to interact with to produce the juggling. It's this idea. Whereas the experience would be a description of the relationships between those interactions, between those actions or those expressions. So the notes that a musician produces, the relationship between those notes is what produces the music. Just like with juggling, it's the relationship between our interactions that produces the experience as well. Um, And then we talked about global activation and universal accessibility. So, in understanding these conditions about juggling and looking at the states of mind that they produce, the heavily associated states of mind with these activities, very similar to the states of mind we observe when people play musical instruments as well. And this is where the majority of the benefit and the impact is coming from in terms of growth. The thing is that what I want to emphasize here is that if we compare juggling, the outcomes of juggling, the cognitive impacts of juggling, to the cognitive impacts of playing football, for example, you're going to notice a really big difference. Over the same period of time, over the same amount of exposure, you're going to see a lot more brain development with an activity like juggling than you would with traditional sport. And that's because the traditional sport is really only targeting the regions of the brain that are directly involved in those tasks, because it's a linear process. Information goes out, it keeps going out in one direction, the game progresses. Whereas an activity like juggling or music, it's more cyclical, right? It distorts this linear understanding of information. And in doing that, it allows the brain to communicate more freely without my intention, without my ego trying to anticipate things. It just sort of does strange things that are really beneficial and causes a lot of rapid growth. So this is where I like to focus our conversation, and to me, this is the real impact. When you boil it down and you say, what are all the impacts of juggling? It's its state of mind. If you can produce the state of mind of juggling, you get the impacts of juggling, and this is proven by the research we have that shows us a lack of correlation between skill level and impact. And we find that the impacts of juggling are relative to the amount of time a person spends engaged in the activity itself, because it's the activity that produces the state of mind. So whether you are juggling 7 balls or 3 balls, it's relative to your ability. Whatever it takes to stimulate the state of mind is going to produce the benefit. And we talked about how yoga and meditation are well known for this as well, and why they've been implemented so universally as forms of intervention. Because we know that it doesn't matter your skill level; it matters how long you spend engaged in this state of mind. So that's the real impact of juggling, and that's what we're going to be looking to produce for all of our participants. Because if we can do that, then we're not deciding for them anymore what the impacts are. It's their own brain that's deciding. We're just enhancing their abilities to communicate between their two hemispheres. Another thing to understand about these hemispheres as well, we talked about the communication pathways a little bit. Or no, we're going to talk about that more today, the structure of the brain. So I'll hold off on that idea. I'll wait till we get that. And then we looked at why juggling is inaccessible, because there's nothing about its structure, there's nothing about the relationship of its events, and there's nothing about its state of mind that is inherently inaccessible. There's actually, these conditions are massively accessible. So this makes us ask the question, why is juggling not more accessible in society? And there's a few reasons for that. There's many reasons, but the ones that we focus on in this course, to simplify this, is that the number one is that we should not be defining juggling by its action. If we define juggling by its action, we alienate people. Juggling begins before the three ball tossing cascade. We, for some reason, decided, and now it's like worldwide, this cultural understanding, because you have students in your class never taken a juggling course before, never met a juggler before, and even that person knows that the three ball tossing cascade is where juggling begins. So it really has gotten out of control, this idea, and it needs to change if we want to make juggling more accessible. And we compare this to saying that, like, if you wanted to become a dancer, like, you had to start with a specific style and a specific song, a specific routine, and that was the only way into this activity. And then afterwards, you could start to explore in your own directions. Or the same thing with music, particular instrument, particular song, and there's no other way to enter. This is how we are greeted in society with our educational model. So it's no surprise that people, don't find it accessible. And then beyond that, the structure we use to teach it is I think the part that is where we focused the most yesterday, and we use the 5-step model as an example for that. And the key takeaway there is that it's quite common for majority, the classical approach to teaching the three ball tossing cascade is to use linear scaffolding, which is an effective means of education, right? It's an effective means of teaching things, but it's important to understand that there are certain activities in which that require sensory feedback information, right? So activities that require us to have that sensory feedback information, like music and like juggling. If we are not able to get a sensation of those experiences as we're learning them, then scaffolding is not going to work, because I'm not gaining new information. So if I'm not gaining new information, I'm not processing and making changes to the structure of my brain. So we have to provide sensory experience as part of the learning process. This is true for most activities. I think in general, it's always good to have, but particularly it's necessary when it's an activity that requires us to harmonize with external sensory information. You don't have the experience, you don't have a way to learn that. And we use the comparison of bicycling and swimming to highlight this example. And in those situations, it's super obvious, right? How those solutions came about because of safety needs, and why we neglected those in juggling because we don't have that safety risk. But there's always risks involved in learning, and then we take a look at these concepts, we evaluate these mistakes that we made, and then we accept the challenge and we say, okay, we're not going to change this idea of the three ball tossing cascade being the entry place for juggling for a long time. It will happen eventually, but it's going to take us a while. So we need to really try to at least improve upon this model as is. And it is a good activity to do. It really opens up the brain, but getting people there, we need to sort of take a look at the things that have been stopping them from getting there, and then create a lesson plan that starts to model for us a better way of getting them there, a more effective way of getting them there. And we took a look at the 5-step model, which is really, it's not 5 steps, it's adding 2 new steps. We're talking about adding 2 new steps prior to the classical model of 1 ball, 2 ball, 3 ball. But it's taking a look at what these steps are focused on and how we are delivering these steps that is making the difference, right? Because we take a super big focus here on prioritizing social and emotional learning outcomes above technical. For me, having taught for decades, like, the longer you teach, I think you start to gain more awareness of what people are capable of. And I find that the technical things people can learn on their own. Like, they don't need as much support with that as when it comes to juggling, especially because as we start to understand juggling and all the different ways it can be expressed, it's not up to me how you want to express this idea. So your technical outcomes, those are things you can take responsibility for in this learning process. But us as educators, as facilitators, like, we need to evaluate this learning process now the same way in comparison to the bicycle and the swimming, and recognizing where are the risks. Identify what is the risk of this learning process, because we all have experience teaching this 3-ball cascade lesson, and we see the level of anxiety. We're aware of the level of anxiety that this lesson plan produces. So identifying that if it's not a physical risk, right, it has to be an emotional risk. And any learning process provides emotional risks. And I think this is why it's so important as well that we really need to reevaluate the way we're teaching this lesson, because so many situations I see that there's, we're working with sensitive populations. So asking, these populations to take risk and then not ensuring that they can have success, I don't think that's a really professional way to operate. I think we should take more responsibility for this. So I proposed the 5-step juggling model, and we took a look at how by shifting our focus, by not emphasizing technique, by not giving instruction, never giving instruction, using storytelling, using modeling, creating an environment of play, causing each step of the way to feel like its sense of conclusion, right? Instead of having the conclusion come at the end, now we make every step its own conclusion. And one of the ways we strengthen that idea is allowing people to create with the material. Because once you start to create with material, you feel you've concluded your learning process, right? So allowing students to create with the material as well, not waiting until they get so much technical skill to start showing them that you can express with juggling, that you don't have to be a genius, you don't have to be an elite juggler to create your own form, your own unique expression. You know, we don't have this stereotype or this bias with dance, but we do this with juggling so much. Like, you have to get all this skill and then you can perform it. Like, no, you can perform from the beginning. This is one of the purposes. And in doing this and shifting this priority and focusing on this really providing emotional safety as part of this learning process, the same way training wheels provide physical safety, we end up exceeding the developmental levels through this play-based learning strategy and ensuring higher levels of student success. So it's sort of, what is the word? Ironic or counterintuitive maybe at first, because especially if you're someone who's been teaching technically for a long time, you're like, how am I going to get higher results by not focusing on the outcome that I want? And I guess for this, I would encourage you to watch the original Karate Kid movies, because it kind of works like that idea, you know, like wax on, wax off. Sometimes we often find better learning results if people aren't aware of the thing that they're learning, because that's going to cause them to be more present in their learning process. And I think our current educational models and mainstream education encourages us not to be, right? It always encourages us to go for expectation, for look for outcome. There's a right answer. You have it. I need it from you. Whereas in this lesson model, there are no right answers. You know, there's only experimentation. And I think shifting the social environment to that, it causes much higher success rates and much more greater neutrality in terms of who is being able to access the material. So today we're going to start today's topics: functional juggling, determining what makes something functional juggling versus normal juggling. And then we're going to introduce this idea of binary forms. So this is where our theory is going to begin. We're going to start our theory by analyzing the mechanic, the machine that we interact with. So what is the operating system we use to interact with reality? Because we're going to need to understand that if we want to create a formula of the relationships that operating system creates for me. And not all bodies are equal. Not all operating systems are equal. So we need to take a look at ours. And then that's going to allow us to create this idea, this thing we call the theory of process formations, which is really, it's taking a look at which conditions need to be processed for a binary form in space to interact as a single being. And then breaking down the outcomes of each of those conditions. So that's going to allow us to create an equation to structure, okay, what are the sequencing relationships that I want to produce to develop someone for juggling? And then I can just focus on developing those aspects. And these are the same sequencing relationships you need for dance as well. So it's very transferable. The theory of process formations, all of these ideas we're doing with the juggle board, you put these points on the floor and use your feet instead. And you have a system for developing sequencing relationships with dance as well. So we're going to look at that today. And then we're going to talk about a little bit about that sensory relationship, that fourth part of the definition, and how that relates to us determining challenge for scaffolding. You know, we're always going to be looking for ways, once we have this system, to scaffold it, to extend its spectrum in both directions, to make it more challenging in this system and less challenging. And one of the ways we have to do that with our formula solution is we have this ability to identify each of its components now and take out different parts. So the need to harmonize with external sensory information is a huge part of developing your relationship with juggling. I think it's the part that most people struggle with more so than the sequencing, because it's not common for all of us to have this sense of awareness with objects in space, and it takes time to develop. So one of the ways we're able to make these activities more accessible from the beginning, to not have to wait for the person to be ready to manage that sensory relationship, is we can use static interactions. And we're going to talk about the difference with that. It's really about the difference in energy, right? Dynamic versus potential energy, and how each of those states of being, for an object, communicates different information to us. Ready? Let's go. Functional juggling. What is functional juggling? Functional juggling is juggling. That's the answer. What determines something about juggling to be functional or not is based on the intention of its interaction and not that of its design. Interactions with juggling are considered to be functional whenever there is an intention to develop something other than the expression of juggling itself. So this word is kind of new. It kind of caught on. Lapo Buteri is the first person to have used it. I heard him use it first, and then I started to repeat it. And it's new vocabulary for us. It's an attempt to try to give you guys language to talk about what it is that you're doing. But its meaning is a little bit subjective still. For me, its meaning is that it's whenever the intention is when I use juggling, when I interact with juggling for the intention to develop something other than juggling. So any expression of juggling can be functional or non-functional. It depends what my intention is really. So as this term continues to develop, the only thing that's important for me to understand, for everyone to understand, is that we make a separation between the apparatus and the terminology, right? Because we don't want to repeat that mistake of understanding juggling by its action. We don't want to repeat the mistake of understanding functional juggling by its apparatus, right? So the modified and adaptive representations of functional juggling, most commonly associated with its facilitation, like the juggle board and these other props, they don't hold. They are not the meaning of this word. They don't hold any relevance to the terminology. Those are just representations of juggling, and determining how I'm using them, is whether or not I call it functional or not. Although some apparatus are specifically designed to be inclusive, this is true. It cannot be said that any activity which embodies the experience of juggling is anything other than that which also makes it juggling. So this is important to understand as well, because I've heard a lot of people come to this material with an idea that, like, oh, this is nice, this is like juggling, or that will help somebody juggle. No, it's not like juggling. It does help people juggle, but it's because it is juggling, right? We don't want people to see these apparatus as being something other than juggling, because if they're produced in the same state of mind, if they're embodying the same relationships with external information, then if what else are they? If it's not juggling, what would you call it? So it is not correct to think of functional juggling as being something other than juggling, because functional juggling is juggling, only with slightly different expectations for its outcome. So if I use a 3-ball cascade to help you with your ADHD, um, then it's functional. And if I teach you the 3-ball cascade so that you can just enjoy the 3-ball cascade, then it's just juggling. I find that most experiences of juggling are functional, whether we want them to be or not. Like, I personally experienced a lot of benefits from juggling before I realized that I was using it in this functional way. They're just sort of inevitable byproducts of the experience itself. It's sort of hard not to have a functional impact because enhancing your cognition, enhancing this communication is just having so many positive impacts. But our personal intention, what our means, our purpose for interacting. Yes. Okay. Here comes the theory. Here comes the beginning of the theory. How we end up to this place where we can describe a system for creating juggling, an understanding for what relationships we want to develop, um, without ever actually describing its action. That's the challenge now. So to begin with, we're going to take a look at our form, particularly our communication, how we communicate, our nervous system. So for starters, the human body and brain are binary, meaning that they consist of two halves, a left side and a right side. I have a left side of my nervous system and a right side of my nervous system. Each side is symmetric and mirrors that of the other, with the left side of the brain controlling the right side of the body and the right side of the body controlling the left side of the brain. So I don't know if this is pretty common knowledge. Most people understand this, that our nervous systems and our hemispheres of our brain are crossed, are actually crossed. So the information from this side of my body is always received on the opposite side of my brain. That's where the information goes. And it's information from my nervous system that allows me to process reality. So understanding that all of the information I'm collecting now is divided into two systems. and each of those systems communicate to opposite hemispheres of the brain. So that what this introduces to us is this idea of following the pathway. We want to find the pathway. We're focused on sequence and relationships, which we observe in reality as movements with our body, but those movements are related to a certain sequence of information in the brain. So we're trying to follow that pathway first. We want to understand what is the software that we are operating on. So for information to get from one side of the body to the other, it has to first travel to its corresponding hemisphere. So if information comes in, if I receive information, if I have information on this side of my body and I want it to send it to my other hand, like when I make a throw, for example, that information has to travel first up to its corresponding side of the hemisphere, cross over to the other side, and then go down in order for that communication to be received. This is the basic structure. There's a lot more depth we can go in here, but it's about what we need to know to apply our theory. So sensory information that is received from one side of the body will always be processed first in its corresponding side of the brain. Applying this dichotomy to the anatomy of our brain requires some discussion of a specific region known as the corpus callosum, which actually sits, it's like the acorn of the brain. It's like the center of the brain. And it makes sense because it's sort of the axle or the bridge between the two hemispheres. It is possible for the brain to make connections between hemispheres outside of this region, but this region in particular, it serves this function. And it's a limited region. It has a limited capacity. Its capacity is much smaller than the capacity of both hemispheres combined, obviously. And our ability to communicate information across this region is really the challenge of the sequencing information, because this is where the traffic gets narrow. So we looked at the nervous system, and there's a lots of ways, different pathways for all this information to flow. But when it changes sides, it only has a very narrow window, very narrow location in which it can do this. So that's given us an understanding now of how to create challenge as well. Because we're able to, once we start to break down these different relationships that we form when we juggle, we can find a way to quantify how much traffic at a minimum, like a general sense of how much communication is being caused to cross over this specific region. This structure is responsible for communicating information back and forth between the two hemispheres. And then the one thing I wanted to say about this, to point out right now, like it's going to make more sense later, but essentially, if we want the brain to grow, right, we have to put pressure on the system. The system is not going to expand unless it has to, right? That's not how things work. And in space with our bodies, we know very well, it's very obvious, like what we do is we use resistance in space. If I want to strengthen my muscle mass, I use resistance in space. I put, a weight that creates resistance. Whereas with the brain, the way that we're going to trigger this to happen, to cause it to expand, is we're recognizing this particular pathway of communication now. We're going to structure a higher, different sequencing relationships that are going to trigger different amounts of communication across this particular region. And then we are going to use time as our resistor. So once the person is able to sequence a certain pattern of information across this region, then I can use time by reducing how much time the person has to process that sequence. Will put pressure on this system. And if we put pressure on the system, we can cause it to expand. So this is the beginning of like how we're going to target and what mechanism we're working with, how we're evaluating this theory of process formations. Because we're not thinking about throws, we're not thinking about actions, we're thinking about information processing. So understanding this communication pattern, this binary structure, it gives us the foundation for all of our communication, all of our interactions with space. Because whenever something is experienced by one side of the body, sensory information about its experience needs to be communicated first to its corresponding side of the brain. Very repetitive. Now, dependent on the outcome of the interaction, this is where it starts to get interesting. Information about its experience will need to be communicated in one of either two directions. So once information arrives in one hemisphere of my brain, it can only leave in one of two directions, which is going bilaterally, it's crossing over to the other side, or it's going back out the way it came. And that's what I mean by binary, right? We have binary solutions. We go in and we can track the information now. It's going across or it's going back out. And it's our ability to track that allows us to structure the system, to design these relationships. So to start with, to illustrate this idea, if you have a lateral interaction, if you have a ball in one hand and you throw the ball up and it comes back down to the same hand, information about that experience doesn't need to be communicated to the other side. It's not affected. The other side of my body is not affected by that information. So you can see in this first illustration, the information goes up, it stays in the same side of the brain. It's being interacted with one side of the body. Whereas when we involve both sides of the body and have an event that travels from one side of my body to another, like a juggling throw, it starts off in one, the information about the object is in one hemisphere of my brain. Right now, this information is here. As the object travels through the air and arrives in my other hand, during the time it was in the air, what my brain should have been able to do was take the information from the object, transfer it across my corpus callosum, and send it down to the other side of my body so that my body can have awareness of where that object is going to be in space and when. This is what has to happen. And when you start to break it down this way, you can start to see that, okay, so now we have this binary switch, right? It's an on and off switch we can create. We know how to cause a bilateral signal. We don't know all of the ways. We're going to break that down, but this is the idea, to identify all of the relationships that cause bilateral sequencing and which ones do not, and then to structure them in an order of complexity, meaning which relationships require me to process more information bilaterally and which ones require me to process less, because the ones that require more processing of bilateral information are going to be the ones that are more challenging. And that's really important for us to understand as educators. So to start to structure this theory, ultimately we're going to try to create like a really simple like matrix to show like what are the possible relationships. So ends up being like a really helpful like toolkit guide, like visual, super fast, super quick. These are my relationships, and it's spatial as well, so I like it. But we're focused on the outcomes, the binary outcomes, or the sequencing relationships of three conditions, which are space, time, and signal. This is because in our reality, we have, 4 dimensions, the space, the 3 dimensions of space and the 1 dimension of time. And then outside, that's really all we need to begin with. But we have the third condition, which is signal, which describes the relationship between each event on each side. So from the beginning, it's important to understand that signal doesn't actually affect the structure of our sequencing relationship with space and time. It affects the relationship between each side. It'll make more sense when we give examples. So the idea is that each factor includes its own set of binary outcomes, right? If I get spatial information from this side of my body, I'm going to deal with it in one of 2 ways. If I get tempo information from one side of my body, a sense of time, if I use sensory integration to produce a sense of time with one side of my body, once it arrives, it's only going to go in one of 2 directions. And if I use a particular signal to produce my expression of juggling, once it arrives, it can only go in one of 2 directions. So for space, it's going to be lateral or bilateral. For time, it's going to be synchronous or asynchronous. And for signal, it's going to be associated or disassociated. And what I've done here is I've color-coded them based off which relationship is going to require more or less bilateral sequencing. So we have these binary outcomes, but we also have a challenge level to them. It's like a negative and a positive. So lateral would be the easier, bilateral would be the harder. Synchronous, less communication; asynchronous, more communication. Associated, less communication; disassociated, more communication. This is what we are trying to evaluate. To break down these relationships, or to each condition now, to look at each condition and the outcomes for each condition. For time, we can have either a synchronous or an asynchronous relationship with time. And a synchronous relationship with time just means that its events are happening simultaneously. So anytime I'm doing 2 things on either side of one thing on either side of my body simultaneously, it creates a synchronous relationship with time. And what's important to understand about that relationship is that initially both sides of the body are going to have to communicate with each other to synchronize their behavior. But once they've synchronized, they can actually hold that tempo on their own without having to constantly communicate. And once in a while, they'll check in with each other about their positions in time, but not constantly. So that requires me to communicate less about time. Whereas in asynchronous relationship, when the events are alternating in time, is causing me to communicate constantly about the position in time because they're constantly changing. So they learn each other's timing at the beginning, but because they're asynchronous now, there's a lot more communication talking about the location of those events, and there are more events more often. So asynchronous is a pretty big jump in terms of how many bilateral sequences are required. Going from synchronous to asynchronous, we see a lot more communication taking place. And then for space, we have the lateral or the bilateral. The obvious and the simple one is lateral. There's not much. There's no complexity to this relationship. It's just something stays. You know, if I'm doing something on one side of my body, that's it. There's no need to communicate. If the outcome of the action on one side of my body doesn't affect the other side, information doesn't need to be communicated about that particular event. And then, but for bilateral communications with space is where we start to see a little bit more complexity occur, at least with the activities that we tend to do with juggling. So bilateral sequencing relationships with space require that their information be communicated between the two sides of our brain, and there are several ways to trigger or subcategorize these types of interactions when we're working with juggling. There's much more than this when you start to play like different dimensions, and like Poi, for example, works with a lot of different planes, so you get a lot more levels to this. But for traditional toss juggling and what we're doing with the juggle board and the 5-point sequencing maps, these are the three primary that we're going to be focused on, or that we tend to interact with. So it goes exchanging of objects. So whether or not an object changes sides will determine whether or not information changes sides. And then we have exchanging of location. So whether or not one side of my body wants to interact on the other side of my body will determine a flow of information as well. Object and location are interesting because they work in sort of opposite directions. Like when I send an object from one side to the other, information is being like delivered from one side of the body. It's like one side of the body is saying, "Hey, heads up for this." Whereas when I reach across my midline, it's more a request for information is being made. Because in order for my hand to know where things are while it moves on the opposite side of my body without seeing it, I need information about that space. And that space is contained on the opposite side of my body. So whenever we cross our midline, we cause communication. And then the third condition, or the third way we produce this signal, is through geometric exchanges. So asymmetry. Asymmetric reflected symmetry over time. So anytime there's a pattern, we have a few examples of this where it sort of alternates side to side, its positioning, and it's a reflection of itself. In those situations, the brain will start to reflect those images. So it starts to transmit a lot of visual information as it's trying to harmonize that equation. So it's really cool. It's a different type of stimulation, but it's causing bilateral communication to occur. So in the example here, I have, if you throw one ball high and one ball low, and then you switch which one's high and which one's low, or even just synchronous throws. When you try to throw synchronous, you see how one throw is not equal. The brain tries to balance that out over time. It does this without us knowing it as well. It just does it when it receives. The more sensory feedback information it has, the more it does this. So these are going to be the three ways that we're going to interact with space. And then the cool thing about this is, in deconstructing all of these elements of juggling, it really makes it easy for us to compartmentalize its learning structure, to really plug and play here. Because now I have three different ways that I can cause bilateral signals to occur in relationship to space. So I can start to combine them. So any relationship with space can be sequenced individually or combined together. If I want to deconstruct the level of challenge, I can focus on each of these relationships first, and then ask the student to sequence them together, right? That would make sense. Two or more conditions of any bilateral value can be sequenced together to form more challenging levels of their process and demand. More bilateral information that's being sent and requested is more pressure on that region of the brain, right? A classic example of this is Mills mess, which combines every object in this pattern, Mills mess. I don't have a video here, but it's super famous. Everybody knows it. It's 3 beats to one side of the body, followed by 3 beats to the other side of the body. So every hand is alternating. So you have asynchronous timing, and then every object is changing hands. So you have bilateral communication about the objects. And then every hand is alternating from lateral to bilateral to lateral to bilateral. So you constantly have information being changed about that relationship with space. And then also it's asymmetrically reflected over time, right? It has 3 beats, and then it has the symmetry on this side. So the brain will start to reflect those 2 images, that visual information. It will start to interchange a lot of visual information. So we know we can do this, and understanding this ability to structure more challenge and less challenge is again really important for how we develop our learning strategies. And then signal, which is the last condition that we talk about, and this is the one that is like I think the least relevant because it doesn't affect the relationships with space and time when the space and time is determining the sequence, right? This is affecting the relationship of the sequence itself. So a signal can be thought of as the technical means by which we choose to manage our expression of juggling. So it's the action. But what's important to understand is that every movement I have with my body, I have a signal that corresponds to that movement inside of my brain. So when I throw a club, I use a different signal than when I throw a ball. And whether or not I'm using the same signal to manage my experience of juggling or different signals is going to have a big impact on how I'm processing that information, how I'm able to process that information. So for every movement we are able to produce with the body, there is a corresponding signal inside of our brain, which relates to the performance of its interaction. And it is important to note that the sequencing conditions of signal do not affect the structural outcomes of their interactions with space and time. So we tend to isolate signal when we are structuring our learning plans and or designing our choreographies or just talking about development in general. But we know that it's always there because any relationship I have for space and time can be either associated or disassociated just by changing whether the actions are the same or different. That's really all the signal means. Are the movements the same on both sides? Is the information on both sides identical, or is it non-identical? Because if it's not identical, then those signals can interfere with each other, whereas identical signals don't pose less risk of interference. So an associated signal is just anytime you're doing the same exact action on both sides. It doesn't matter what the action is; it just matters that it's the same. And then for disassociated, it's just having the action be different. And this is why I say, like, look, we can do the same pattern and we can make it either associated or disassociated just by combining more than one type of action. So anytime you want to create a disassociated relationship with any juggling sequence, you just need to have either more than one type of object that you're interacting with, or you need to use more than one type of movement to produce your activity. So juggling with like one ring, one ball, and one club, you can do the cascade with all balls, and that would be associated. But if I do it with different objects, now it's disassociated because my brain is constantly having to retrieve different signals for each action, and then it's having to organize and take the sensory feedback when it catches the club. It needs to recognize that it caught the club, that it has to find the signal for the club and send the signal for the club. So you see how disassociated is going to create a lot more complexity very rapidly, and that it's easy for us to transform the other relationships just by changing the action or the object. Okay, so to construct this matrix now, as we said, we're not going to take signal into consideration at this point. So when formulating the equations of process formations, it's important to separate the categories of associated from disassociated. So we're not talking about signal, because associated formations are easier to sequence than disassociated, but neither affect the structural outcome of their interactions with space and time. So in general, we're always going to be starting, whatever development plan we have with associated, obviously. It's important that we understand the challenge level is harder with disassociated, but we don't really focus on that material in our training seminar because it's very easy to create once you have this foundation first. So the way that it works is we put time on the x-axis and space on the y-axis, and we find out what are the collections. It's like Battleship, right? So we end up with synchronous lateral, asynchronous lateral, synchronous bilateral, and asynchronous bilateral. For all the conditions for space and time, there's only two. There's only two possible ways that information can travel, right? And it's going to either be one of these four relationships that are here. So this is it. There are no more than this. From an external perspective, juggling seems like it has all of these activities, all of these different expressions. There's all these different tricks, millions and millions and millions of tricks. When in reality, no. Any juggling trick you do is going to be an expression of one of these four relationships. Just like any dance move you can come up with will be an expression of one of these four relationships. Because as long as you're a human being, right? As long as you have a bilateral nervous system, then it's going to be one of these four relationships and nothing else. And I think that can be maybe a little bit disappointing. I don't know if for in terms of like our expectations for material, but for me, I think it's a celebration because it really now lets us focus as educators. Like we say, okay, these are the 4 relationships I need to develop. We don't need to think about the action. We just need to think about developing these relationships. The more we can develop these relationships, the greater the person's sequencing capacity becomes. The more they're going to be able to express juggling on in any way that they desire. You know, our goal is to give them a language. So to break down that language of juggling, we're gonna do it by focusing on each of these relationships individually, recognizing the difference in the process in between each of these relationships, and then creating a structure for how we want to expose them as well. So reflecting on how we are being impacted by each of these relationships, what they are, how they impact us, and how that affects, you know, our structure and of learning, right? So to begin with, synchronous lateral. Synchronous lateral is going to be the first formation. It is the easiest formation for us to process. And we're going to take a look here at how the spatial relationship and the time relationship is affecting that. So in this situation, the relationship between space is divided. And because we process space, we project onto space this division. The same division we have with our body is projected onto space. So we like to keep that separate. It's why people don't like to cross their midline. So here the information is separated. It's not having to cross over. Less communication on that area. Whereas with timing, it's also consolidated because the signals are all the same. The space is separated. It's synchronous. They're sending at the same exact time. So they're having to communicate a lot less about their positions in time as well. So synchronous lateral ends up being this. I think, I'm not sure if you should be doing this. If you want to do this along, if you have your balls, you know, at any moment, I can't see you guys right now, but if you wanted to just take 2 objects, we're going to be doing more exercises like this. So just follow along if you want to, in the background if you want to. But it can be nice to have the experience and just be reflected on it in this different way, because we know these patterns, we know these movements, but we're thinking about them in a different way now. We're saying, how does this pattern affect my communication with space? How does this pattern affect my communication with time? That's what we're looking at here. And then we have asynchronous. And in this situation, the relationship with space is still divided, asynchronous lateral. We continue to keep the relationship with space divided. Their information is not having to be exchanged. Whereas now the timing is divided. So we added more bilateral communication in regards to time, so that it's an incremental change. We recognize, okay, here's the simpler equation for space and the simpler equation for time. The next step is going to be to change one of those conditions, right? And we start off by changing the relationship with time. Because even though that does require a lot more bilateral communication to occur, it's still easier and more accessible than getting someone to cross their midline. Our resistance and to wanting to cross that midline is very strong, and that's going to be the harder challenge. So it's also going to cause more communication, because then we end up with synchronous bilateral, the third level. And in synchronous bilateral now, we say, okay, now we want to increase the complexity of the relationship with space. We want the person to communicate more information bilaterally about space, but we're going to reduce the complexity of the time. So it's like a trade-off. Last time I asked you to deal with a more complex relationship with time. This time I'm going to ask you to deal with a more complex relationship with space. So we are systematically targeting each of the subtle variations in sequence and relationships. And each of these sequence and relationships relates to a certain connectivity in the brain, right? That's producing that ability to sequence it. So the more repetition we have with these relationships, the stronger that connectivity gets. And this relates to identifying what the experience is, so we can start to target it and develop it, right? If we don't have experience, we don't have learning. And this is really helpful for that. So then we get to asynchronous bilateral, which ironically is the 3-ball tossing cascade. I think maybe this is where it starts to become clear, like my level of like just impatience or like not understanding why we insist on starting, how this ever became the start point of juggling. Because if you evaluate it based off its sequence in relationships, it is asking us to communicate information bilaterally about space because the objects are always changing sides. And it's also asynchronous timing. So it's causing each side to have to communicate constantly about where the other one is in time. It's a very challenging task. It requires the most amount out of the 4 formations that we can express juggling with now. This is the one that requires the most amount of bilateral sequencing communication, and yet we make it our start point. For the disassociated element, we don't have to repeat all of these sequences again for you because it's just a matter of changing the action between sides. So anything you can do associated, you can do associated. It's just changing the actions in between sides or changing the objects that you use. And to be most juggling patterns, most site swap patterns are disassociated. Anytime you have more than one number in a site swap pattern, it's disassociated because the signal for throw in a 3 is not the same as throw in a 4. They're different signals inside of my brain. It's why things like 5, 3, 1, disassociation is the idea. So when we lay this out now, if we're going to evaluate the entire list of possible formations, there are 8. There are a total of 8 because of the condition of 4 for associated and 4 for disassociated. What I want to do right now is lay them all out for you in order of challenge, and to take a look a little bit of like some of the geometric implications, like maybe to kind of give, I want us to have an understanding and an appreciation for how we're structuring these ideas. So I think this helps visualize that. By looking at the first 4 conditions, we know they're going to be associated, obviously, because we're trying to create that structure now. We want to have an understanding for something that we can't see, something that's happening that we can't see. And we're using this understanding of relationships to create that structure. So we know that associated requires less interference with signals. So we know our first 4 activities are going to be associated. After that, we know that lateral is going to be easier to manage than bilateral, less communication required. And then synchronous timing is going to be easier. So you can get a sense here of how this chart starts to develop, right? We start off with the simplest conditions of everything first, and we gradually, each step of the way, systematically target one individual capacity development at a time. This is what this chart allows me to do. It allows me to separate each of these learning capacities and develop them individually, and then ask the student to put them together. And it also helps us understand that asynchronous bilateral is the most complicated state of these 4 relationships, which is the 3-ball cascade. So if you weren't convinced before why we shouldn't start with that activity, this chart should make it really clear to us. The thing to understand is when we get to disassociated, the relationship with time changes. And by that, what I mean, obviously, the disassociated, they're all the last 4 patterns. And then bilateral is going to be more challenging than lateral. So that obviously is structured in that way. But if you notice here now, it's synchronous that is more challenging than asynchronous. And this is because whenever we have more than one signal, it is going to be easier to avoid interference when I'm doing them one at a time versus doing them at the same time. This example of like the gun and the rabbit, if you do it synchronous at the same time, it's very tricky. But if I do one at a time, then those signals don't interfere with each other. And you'll see this when you see this when people do disassociated. They try to, spin the ball or something instead of the club, right? They get disassociated. But when you are structuring your learning models, your choreographies, your facilitations, you need to be aware that when you start to expose students to dissociative relationships, then we switch from synchronous being the simpler form of interaction to asynchronous being the simpler form of interaction. That's the key thing to understand. Because synchronous bilateral disassociated for the site swap, for the one site swap fan, now we can talk about this, would be like 6x4, would be synchronous bilateral disassociated, would be an example of that. Practice exercise. So this is a real quick one. Let me actually see you guys for this quickly. I'll do a stop screen share. It'd be cooler. Do that. All right, so everybody, show me your hands. Because like I said, like all of this theory, I'm sure is just like, what the crap? Why is he talking about all these weird terms? The application, super simple, super obvious. I'm just here to try to give you guys a background so you can understand how to structure it and apply it, right? Like that's the difference. Doing it is the easy part, okay? Because doing it means this. Everyone hold up their hands like this, and then push your hands forward and bring them back. Synchronous lateral. We don't care about how we're producing this relationship, right? We're thinking about the relationship between our body now, not its action, right? So if I want to do asynchronous lateral, then I just change the tempo. So this is asynchronous lateral. And then synchronous bilateral for this one with our facilitation, we like to do it by crossing the arms this way and then uncrossing and then crossing again, but crossing the other direction, right? So the hand on top should always change. That's going to be the healthiest way to condition this behavior. So that would be synchronous bilateral. And then asynchronous bilateral, I'm pretty sure we already figured out, is going to be boom, boom, asynchronous bilateral. And each of these sequencing relationships relate to different categories of patterns that I can perform, right? Every site swap pattern can be categorized into one of these 4 conditions or one of these 8 conditions. So then if you wanted to make it disassociated, you would just change the side. But what I want to do now is, because the language is a little bit new, and just to drive this home, if you guys can now start to tap on your legs. So tap on your legs, synchronous lateral, right? And then I'm going to start to call out different formations, one of these 4, and I want you to change to that behavior, okay? Just so we drive this home. So right now you're synchronous lateral. Show me synchronous bilateral. What does synchronous bilateral look like? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love the faces of like hesitant confusion. Like, I think is this too easy? This too obvious to make sense. It's super obvious. Yeah. And then asynchronous bilateral. Mm-hmm. Asynchronous lateral. Asynchronous lateral. Very good. Very good. So lateral means not crossing. Yeah. Good. And now make that disassociated. Now do something disassociated. I see. Yeah. Disassociated. So same sequence of movements, but more than one action. Yeah. So like, I don't know, like this would be synchronous lateral disassociated, something like that, right? You just need more than one type of movement. Good. Yeah. Okay. That was it. Just because I know it sounds really heavy, but then when you break, once we have these 4 relationships, you don't have to go back and explain where they came from, right? I just gave you an understanding of where they came from. Your takeaway from this is that these are the relationships, and this is the order of complexity that they relate to in terms of processing, right? Not necessarily physically, right? Depending on how we choose to express the juggling, this sequence, this order of development might change, and but the relationships don't here. So yeah, so that's what I mean by things sounding a lot more complicated than they are, for sure. I have to pin video and play. Okay, so these are our 4 basic relationships. We're going to do so much repetition of this that there's going to become like on the back of our eyelids. Okay, so those are the possible sequencing relationships. Now we've identified. We created. We looked at our processing system, our nervous system, and our brain, which is how we take information in from reality and how we decide to interact with reality. Pretty important stuff, right? And it has this sort of system of crossing over and only having this particular region that all of that information from both sides, it has to communicate. So we identified that region, and then we looked at the outcomes for each of the conditions that I need to process, which are space, time, and signal. And that's how we get this theory of process formation, which now gives us an understanding of the sequencing relationships we wish to develop. The last thing to talk about today is about that sensory relationship, this need to harmonize with external sensory information. And this brings up the topic of static versus dynamic interactions with juggling. So to start with, it is a common thought to assume that the relationships we form with juggling will have something to do with gravity. And this has shaped a lot of our misunderstandings about it. So you always talk about people like, oh, I'm fighting gravity, or something to do with gravity. And gravity is something that, even like a physicist will tell you, like, we don't know anything about. Like, we think we know, but we have no freaking clue. So gravity is not an actual force. It is the curvature of space-time. As objects travel through it, they carry and absorb sensory information about its existence. So for this, I make the comparison of 2 fish that are swimming in water. And the one fish asks the other fish, how is the water today? And the other fish responds, what is water? Because for the fish, when you are in something that is ubiquitous, it's difficult. You have no comparison to know the separation It's hard to understand that thing. And for us, space time is definitely that thing. But we are very aware of it subconsciously. We're constantly taking information about it. It's how, we move around and we interact. Um, so being aware of this relationship and how we gain information, just like we can be aware of how we can observe information about water based off the objects that move through it, right? Same idea. We can observe information from objects that move through space, but we don't see it, so we have to make contact with it. That's the idea here. And it's that information that we are training ourselves to harmonize with, to be aware of and harmonize with that information. So objects at rest do not reflect as much sensory information about their space-time experiences as do objects which remain in motion. Motion through space equates to energy. When we have motion, we have energy. And energy produces a frequency, which is what allows us to create our harmonic relationship to juggling. Just like sound produces a frequency, motion produces a frequency, and it's that frequency that we're interacting with. Every time I interact with that object, I send the object into space, it collects information about the space when it comes back to me. And in order for me to get my timing right with whatever pattern, whatever sequence I'm trying to produce, I need to harmonize with it. Just like a musician, in order to get their composition right, they need to harmonize with the sound. They need to hear the sound, recognize what note it was in, and then respond to that sensory feedback information. So it's this constant dialogue that has to occur. Dynamic expression. So to start with, what we refer to as a dynamic expression is any time we interact with an object that is in motion through space. Like everything is in motion. There is no such thing as a static object in the universe. There's no such thing as static. We're moving hundreds of thousands of kilometers per hour right now. But when we're talking about motion, we mean motion relative to ourselves. So because that's where we're going to gain that sensory feedback information. So these forms of interaction relate to authentic experiences of juggling. So in order for us to have an authentic experience of juggling, we have to fulfill that equation. And part of that equation is harmonization with external information. So if we want to have an authentic experience of juggling, we need to have this relationship with sensory information as well, in order for us to harmonize with it. And this can be said to be similar to the way that both a dancer and a musician respond to the sensory feedback information of sound. How does a dancer know when to move when they move, or how much force or rhythm to have to respond to frequency of sound, which creates a sense of time, right? A distorted sense of time because it's nonlinear as well. And music does the same thing, but they're processing it with their ear. The musician, they rely on tactile too. Music is similar to juggling in this way because they're interacting with an object, a prop, essentially. So the vibration in the strings as well is giving them a lot of sensory feedback information that they're learning to harmonize with as well. And this is the concept in juggling. So when we see juggling as a whole, as its state of mind, as its being, we are required to interact, to have this sensory relationship. Otherwise, we're not necessarily juggling. We're doing something. We're still developing sequencing relationships and all those things, but it wouldn't be considered an authentic experience. The stimulation is going to be lower. But understanding this and then recognizing the alternatives helps us develop more enhanced learning models because we can separate the challenge. So a static expression is basically interacting with objects that don't move, that are not in motion, because those objects contain potential energy, but not kinetic energy. And it's the kinetic energy that we use, that our body uses to translate into its relationship, to figure out how to respond. We need to receive kinetic energy in order to do this. But whenever we don't receive kinetic energy, meaning static, so if I just sequenced an order of events, but I wasn't having to respond to an external sense of time, we would refer to this as being static. And although it's not an authentic stimulation of juggling because it lacks the need to harmonize with external information, we are still able to utilize these types of experiences as a way to diversify and appropriately scaffold functionality into many existing activities. So we don't ignore this element. We say, okay, we crossed the line. We went below juggling. So we're somewhere below juggling here, but we're really close. It's a spectrum. We don't have to create a line. And we could say, wow, I can focus on developing anti-entropic sequencing relationships with orbital events. And then I can choose, once I have that capacity, then I can choose to apply that or express that, harmonizing in different ways, whether that be dance or juggling. Right? We're not limited. If we approach this learning process this way, we're even free to go into other disciplines. It's a foundation for capacity, for interacting with space-time. So, static interactions can be thought of as those which do not involve motion through space and thus lack sensory feedback information about their environments. And here I just included a little chart to kind of show you, like, there's the difference, the key difference here, it's whether we interact with kinetic energy or potential energy. And it's kinetic energy is what causes us to harmonize. But to take a look at all the different types of kinetic energies there are in the universe, because we can do this. We have the capacity to do this with, we can apply this formula to any of these stimulations. So whether it's heat energy, mechanical energy, electrical energy, magnetic energy, all of these things can be harmonized. We as human beings can take in sensory information about those things and create a harmonized relationship with them. It's sort of a phenomenon. I know it sounds a little bit crazy, but and abstract, but that's probably why juggling also feels so damn good. Like juggling gives you a really good feeling. And I think the fact that we are, if you break down what it requires us to do, just like what is dances requiring you to harmonize with so much external information, like I don't think, for me, it's not surprising that it's so euphoric, right? When you understand it this way, as an individual forming that connection with space, I think is very humbling and it's very euphoric. So taking a look at this separation with the static and the dynamic helps us understand how to structure and develop those relationships. By, if a person is not able to sequence the activity, having to respond to spatial information, then we should go back to having them sequence the activity without the need to respond to that information. Yeah. Whew. Let me take a drink. Now is coming time for application. So you guys are going to start getting involved now. I'm just going to do this introduction of something and we'll start to play. So we want to talk about functional integration now, because that really relates to the static part. So whenever we're doing a static interaction, we have a lot of creative license, a lot of freedom in what we can make that action be. When we're doing dynamic, we're more limited, right? There's less ways that objects can move through space than objects cannot move through space. So static interactions give us this whole world of opportunity to start to work with other objects. And when we start to reflect on the intentions of why we might want to incorporate other objects, is where we start to really reach outside our existing community of social circus. It's when we start to find bridges and build partnerships with new industries, particularly any industry that is interested in developing time on task and repetition, which is a lot of industries, therapeutic industries, rehabilitation, these sorts of fields, because the reality in developing any capacity, any motor control capacity, is you have to do it. There's no way. If you need to improve connectivity, if you need to improve your motor skill, you have to do it a lot of times. There's no other solution. So in this sense, as we begin to find ways to invite other sorts of disciplines into our structure of juggling, we create a new platform by which we can serve as a means, juggling can serve as a means to encourage time on task, repetition, and variation of movement for other disciplines, other fields. Like many times I partner with doctors and they give me the participant and they introduce me to the participant and they tell me what they want that person to do. And then I structure whatever static outcome it is the doctor wants into my dynamic system of juggling, because juggling causes high level engagement, repetition, time on task, motivation, as well as developing this altered state of mind. So anything we can develop while we're in a state of mind of juggling is going to be enhanced. And now we're going to start to look at where we find those opportunities. So by replacing the action of functional juggling activity with that of something like pouring cups of water or drawing with crayons, something that has a functional intention, we transform the beneficial outcomes of juggling into completely new fields of therapeutic practice. Because primarily in therapy, they are highly concerned or highly focused on time on task and repetition. I partner a lot with these organizations, and that's the vein of their existence. When they wake up in the morning, they want to know how can they get more repetitions, because the repetitions is what helps the person recover, right? So it makes sense. But they don't necessarily, these are people who are coming from backgrounds where they've spent decades studying what is wrong with these populations, what these people are not able to do. Whereas we as circus artists, and with this approach to juggling now, we don't care what the person can't do. We only are concerned with what they are able to do. And we come from a background where we are looking for possibilities, I think the reason social circus is so inclusive in general is because we have this approach. When someone comes to us, we don't create an expectation for the person. We first observe what they offer, and then we find a way to work with that. And this is the idea with the functional juggling too. So it makes it really effortless for us to integrate and invite different types of people, and for different outcomes as well. And also the structures of play here, they lend themselves so much to nonverbal communication strategies because it's such a tactile system of play as well. And that nonverbal communication strategy is what allows me as a juggler to actually be able to communicate more effectively quite often with nonverbal participants than the clinical people are, because I'm using touch. I'm using touch to communicate, and that's a lot more universal. So another thing to take into consideration is, when you when you start working with disabilities, as we like to people call it, right? I don't like this term, but when you start to work with disabilities, uh, having a solution for these groups of people is not even half the problem. The problem is being able to communicate that solution. So many times I observe uh, people trying to get a person to do an activity, but they don't have the comprehension skill to process verbal language or the way that the idea is being presented. So another huge benefit to juggling is it's a tactile language. So we're able to interact with people and create rhythms and influence behaviors. And now we can sort of partner that intention with the intention of other fields as well. So to begin with, to get into this video here, what you're going to see now is various demonstrations of the theory of process formations. I am facilitating. My facilitation goal right now is to engage the person in the sequencing relationships of the theory of process formations, because in doing so, I know that I am developing their capacity for juggling. These interactions right now are static. They are not producing an external sense of time from motion in space, because we put the objects down and they become static. What we are being motivated by is what I call social tempo. So there's a lot of psychology involved here, but if you create a mirrored system of interaction and then you mirror the other person's behavior and their tempo, that person is likely going to mirror you back, right? This is sort of a human phenomenon, but it's also, dance, right? So you get motivation here through social influence and context. But the whole point of the activity is just to trigger, just to exercise the relationships of the theory of process formations, and then to constantly transform the movement. So we're using functional objects in these examples. You can imagine what are the benefits to someone developing more fine motor control with picking up and putting down coins. Many benefits to this, right? What are the benefits to a person having time on task and repetition with writing? Many benefits. We are not just getting time on task and repetition here, we're also getting bilateral sequencing. We're also developing all those juggling benefits. All the incredible benefits of juggling are still being presented here, but they are not our focus. We're using those benefits more as a stimulation to encourage the behavior. And you can see here how, because it's just a game of mirroring, if I change my behavior, the other person copies the behavior. So that's what enables us to be able to communicate to such wide audiences. Language is not required. And when you talk about wait, no, I'll let the next example come. Really classic example, pouring cups of water, where we are imposing the sequence and relationships of juggling that we know and we understand now. We're creating a false sense of rhythm through social influence, through what I call social tempo, by just mirroring each other. My phone is ringing. Is that one of you guys? No. Somebody else. Think about the functionality. What are the implications of this? Imagine you were working in a clinical center and you needed the person to get time on task and repetition with pouring water, right? And this activity actually comes from a real life example when I was working in a job training center with people with disabilities. And one of the tasks that I was assigned was to improve a young man's ability to pour water. And this is where I created this game. Because the alternative to facilitate in this way is to put a big jug of water on the table and have the person repeat over and over in a linear manner, right? So have to just sit there and repeat, pour 10 cups of water. Okay, repeat, pour 10 cups of water. The idea is simple, and the individual was able to comprehend it, but his level of motivation was so low. He got so demotivated so quickly because it had no relevance to him. He was really interested in talking and being social. That's why that's what he wanted out of the interaction, whereas his facilitator wanted repetition. So I took that idea and I said, I'm going to try this with him. And I did this with him. And I got high level engagement, no interruption. We talked the whole time. And he got so much time on task and repetition. Within a 10-minute facilitation period, we got over 600 repetitions, which is more than the previous standard he was having with his other activities. For a 35-minute session, he was getting around 400 repetitions. And here we did 600 repetitions in 10 minutes. And we did it bilaterally while developing all those other things. So when we think about the impacts and the implications of approaching, just recognizing these relationships of juggling and how we can start to apply them, the action isn't important. We didn't define the action of juggling, so we can use any action we want. You could also compare these activities to dance, because imagine we were doing this with music on in the background. What would be the difference? Would it be dance or would it be juggling? It depends who you are. And I use a lot of music when I play these games as well. I tend to focus a lot on really trying to think of the most functional activity. Like these examples come a lot from my experience working with other clinical fields, and so often they're interested in just the most basic motor control capacity, because we as high functioning people take for granted, like all the self care we provide ourselves, that we're able to provide ourselves, that people with disabilities are not able to provide themselves. So time on task and repetition with picking an object up with a fork and put it in my mouth, really beneficial. All of those previous examples were static. What I want to show you now is the ability to be dynamic. So being dynamic does not require you to have a juggle board, right? It only requires you to have objects that move through space. And however they move is not important. It's only important that they're able to move, because if they can move, they produce energy, they collect information. Soda cans are really easy. If you don't have anything else, you can use soda cans. My suggestion for you, if you don't have a juggle board and you want to improvise these types of games and these types of environments, to play with something that's more cylinder, because a cylinder will have a smaller margin, a greater margin of error, whereas a ball has a higher margin of error because it can roll in any direction. And by reducing the margin of error, then we can allow the person to have more easily access. So like diabolos are another good solution to improvise. And here now we reintroduce this need to harmonize with external sensory information. Every time I receive the ball, I'm gaining information about where that ball was, what direction that ball is moving, how much velocity the ball has, right? Lots of information is being collected from interacting with an object that is in motion. And here are more examples of playing with toilet paper as well. I think when we begin to ask ourselves the question of why we are facilitating these activities, or as we shift our focus away from the juggling itself, because throughout this course with all the tools we have, the juggling is the easy part. Like juggling is super accessible and universal for everyone. Everyone can experience it. It's built into us already. Like it's that universal. This is not the challenge anymore, making the juggling accessible. The challenge or the next step is saying, okay, well, if juggling is so stimulating, if it is so accessible, what else can I use it to develop? What is the potential for development, given our understanding too of this sort of symbiotic relationship that we're able to form with any industry that wants time on task and repetition? Any community that's focused on time on task and repetition, we can form a friendship with. We have something to offer. And it's just constant application of the 4 relationships that we just described. Cool. So for our activity today, I think that went a little bit longer than I was planning, but no, 2:30. Yeah, that went a little bit longer. We still have an hour to play. That's no problem. I think that's what we need. We're going to take about 30 minutes right now for this exercise, and then maybe that's a little bit more time than you need, but you can go to the bathroom, you can detox from all this information. But the idea now is for us to begin to apply the theory of process formation. So understanding these 4 relationships, I want us to work with, next week, we're going to introduce this idea of the 5-point spatial sequencing map. It's what we use with the juggle board. We use 5 points of interaction. For today, I want us to just focus on 4 because we're more looking at the relationships first. So the first thing I want you to do is find 4 objects, any 4 objects you want, and place them in front of you, just like you saw in the video, symmetrically. So 4 objects in front of you symmetrically. I need to be able to see you guys. And then what we're going to be doing is we're only going to be using static interactions for this part, right? The dynamic is going to come later. Having to harmonize with things that are moving is harder. So we're just focused on static right now. So a static interaction could be something as simple as touching those objects, picking those objects up and putting them down. Like pick the object up, do something with it, put it back down, right? That's at a minimum. At a minimum, yeah, exactly. So now we have interaction with these objects. What I want you to do is explore interacting with these objects and then looking at the different sequencing relationships that we can form with them. So synchronous lateral, asynchronous lateral, synchronous bilateral, and asynchronous bilateral. Very similar to when we just moved our hands in space and we tapped. The only thing we're doing now is changing the means of interaction and adding more objects, right? So that's the first step, just to apply the theory of process formations. Look at these really basic sequencing relationships, use them to, to manage your interaction. But then in addition to that, what I also want us to start working on today is focusing on the narrative play, the communication, because as I said, in this situation, we don't have tactile communication. If we're using static, we have to use a social influence. So finding ways to involve storytelling in this activity as well, depending on what the objects are. The objects themselves should lend themselves to an idea, right? Because these are objects that should have functions. If you grabbed a ball, I think I will allow you to have up to 2 balls, but no more than 2 balls. You should be working with functional objects, just objects. We're not working with circus equipment right now. We're working with objects that I would interact with in my daily life, things that are around you. Great. Because every object has a function, right? It has an intention. So in addition to getting the time on task, the repetition, and the sequencing behavior, we also want to find ways to involve the actual function of the object, right? Because that's relevant to development. If I have a phone, what do I do with a phone? Oh, I scroll on my phone. I put my phone to my ear. If I have a toothbrush, what do I do with a toothbrush? Oh, I can do this with a toothbrush. Or I can brush my hair with a toothbrush, right? The idea is to be creative and to be playful. When I play these games, a lot of times the movement will develop as I'm playing. We start off with one movement, the simplest form of motion, and then we start to change it gradually. And then I'll keep changing it and encouraging new behaviors as well. So I want you to focus on sequencing these relationships and thinking about the functionality of the movements as well, and how you might encourage different forms of movements with these types of activities. Clear? Thank you, everybody. I'm going to start the screen share again, and I'll do the final review, and we'll be good for today. Yeah, because we are coming up on time. So you should be able to see my screen, and we will do a review of today's points. So we introduced the terminology, the word functional juggling, which has become associated with this work. And the thing is that it relates to the intention of the juggling, not the representation of the juggling. So any expression of juggling is an expression of juggling. We don't want to we don't want to discriminate between forms of juggling that are somehow different than other forms of juggling. All activities that allow us to experience juggling are equally juggling. It's just some might have other intentions, and in those circumstances, we use this language to describe that. Although some apparatus are specifically designed to be inclusive, it cannot be said that any activity which embodies the experience of juggling is anything other than that, which also makes it juggling. So, this may happen to you, that some people are not convinced that these, the juggle board or these forms of juggling are juggling. And for those conversations, I suggest that you concentrate on the point that if the relationships are the same, if the state of mind and the stimulation is the same, then if it's not juggling, then what else could it be, right? So we don't, and the idea here is not to make the same mistake of putting it into a box like we did with the classical interpretation of juggling. Is understanding juggling as action. We don't want to understand functional juggling or any form of juggling now by its apparatus as well. And I observe that there's a tendency for people to do this at the beginning when they first observe all of this material. It seems so like in a place that it can be natural to try to put that box around it. And I'm saying don't do that, because that will paint us into a corner. We looked at the concept of binary forms. We started off with our theory today, deconstructing how we process information. And it's important to understand that we have a bilateral nervous system, and that we communicate through a specific central region of our brain. all of this information. And our awareness of that and our understanding of the conditions of the universe allows us to structure this theory of process formations, which takes the idea of the conditions of space, time, and signal, understanding this bilateral relationship with information, and comes up with a list of the potential binary outcomes for each of those conditions in terms of how I process their information. And this allows us to create this structure for the theory of process formations, and not only to identify all of the sequence and relationships, but also to have an understanding of how demanding they are, how they affect us, how much energy or precision is required to process them. So we also gain this from this structure as well, and that was the point of this exercise today, to say it's not the action that matters. I can use whatever action I want. It's these sequencing relationships that we're going to be focused on developing. And because I'm not concerned with the action in addition as well in this context, it's also an opportunity for us to start to look at the ways we can incorporate functional ideas. And we're going to be doing that more and more throughout the course. So like today was more about an experimentation for you. I wanted you to focus on using these relationships, recognizing what the relationships are, and now using those relationships to facilitate interactions. And in today's context, we did that using functional, but we're going to go into using the dynamic, the tactile communication strategies as we progress. The idea today was to focus on static interactions with juggling. And although they're not authentic stimulations because they remove the condition of needing to harmonize with external information, they are a valuable training activity for extending the learning spectrum. So we can recognize this division between static expressions of juggling and dynamic expressions of juggling. And we can remove the dynamic element and just work on the sequencing relationships, the anti-entropic orbital events part. And then once a person has that capacity or that foundation, then we can integrate more sensory relationships later on. It makes sense to separate these two. And in addition to providing this scaffolded model for how to make the learning process easier, it's also opening up this new industry for us, where we can use juggling as a platform to facilitate time on task and repetition with functional movements. And that's what starts to make us able to form partnerships with clinical industries outside of juggling, or anyone who's interested in any form of education, really, because anything you want to learn can be incorporated now into a game of juggling. Yeah. So removal of the need for harmonization allows focus to be on development of sequencing capacity instead of technical expression. Integration of functional juggling activity through means of static and dynamic. So today I told you to do just static, but typically when we do these games, we always have a sense of dynamic involved as well, because that's where we get our sense of time. So that's how I'm able to ensure the person moves. When I don't have dynamic, I can't cause the person to move without some sort of social influence, some social cue. So we'll be looking at how to integrate those two stimulations later on. But it produces higher levels of engagement with increased time on task, repetition, and ability to vary and communicate a wide range of ideas for intentions. So another thing I wanted you to take away from this exercise today, and showing like all the variations of movements and the ability to do it incrementally, right? It's very suggestive. It's how we're able to get someone who's nonverbal, perhaps, to understand a lot of ideas. Because if I first start to move the object in a simple way, and you copy that simple movement, then I can increase this complexity gradually. I can say, okay, now flip it. You'll flip it. Okay, now raise it over your head. You'll raise it over your head. And then we can get to more and more complex movements. Whereas if I just started to introduce right away some complex movement, a person who's nonverbal might not comprehend this idea if I don't have the ability to explain it to them that way. So this is the idea. We start with a simple rhythm. We start by using these sequencing relationships, and then that creates this system of play that allows me to be suggestive. And it's our suggestibility with these activities as well that allows us to be so impactful when we're working with people who are not non-typical, right? People who don't rely on the typical means of communication or have the typical expectations for comprehension. This very simple system of play is what allows us to be accessible in our delivery. For homework, you should read and or review chapters 10 through 15, which is going to be introducing the ideas of the spatial sequencing maps and the prop swap notation. It's really going to be helpful if you can read, especially the stuff on the prop swap notation, because it's a lot of information at the beginning. So if you have some of it as a base, it's going to make next week's class a lot easier for you. Even if you read the book and it's still confusing, because again, none of this makes sense until we apply it, right? Um, but yeah, I really encourage you to read for next week. I'm going to say that every week. I'm going to encourage you to read every week, but whatever. So the other homework assignment is to just continue playing with today's activities, but add in dynamic forms of interactions. So we weren't doing this yet, but because if you work with a partner, it's very easy to add dynamic. So same system of play, um, but now you can add in roll in, or I would say not toss in. I wrote toss in here, but just roll in. Same games, but try to add, not all the objects need to roll. You can play with two of the objects roll and two of the objects don't roll, or all of the objects roll, but looking to develop the same relationships, but now playing with some dynamic motions as well and seeing how that changes, right? And you're free to share this. If you arrive 15 minutes early, I'll be here and we can have conversations. Anyone who has conversations or anyone who wants to document and share that, I'm always open for that. I am here for you. Cool. All done. Yay.